Welcome to this journey into one of the most disturbing chapters in American rural history. Before we begin, I want to know, where are you watching this from? And what time is it right now? Are you alone in your room at midnight, or perhaps listening during a quiet morning? Tell me in the comments. Your stories about how you discovered our channel always fascinate me, and they remind me that some histories deserve to be remembered, no matter how dark they are. This is the story of Coldwater Hollow, Maine, a community that disappeared from maps, a lake that held secrets beneath its frozen surface, and a tradition so disturbing that even a century later, historians struggle to speak about it openly. January 1923. The coldest winter in Maine's recorded history. Temperatures plummeted to 30 degrees below zero. Roads became impassable. Railways froze solid. Entire communities found themselves cut off from civilization for months at a time. Among these isolated settlements was Coldwater Hollow, a village of 47 souls clustered around Lake Ashford. The lake stretched 2 miles across, surrounded by dense pine forests that seemed to absorb all sound. During winter, the ice grew thick enough to support horse-drawn sleighs, thick enough to build upon, thick enough to hide what should never have been hidden. On January 14th, 1923, a young nurse named Eleanor Hartley arrived in Coldwater Hollow. She was 24 years old recently. Graduated from Boston General Hospital's nursing program, she had volunteered for rural placement, believing she would bring modern medicine to communities in need. Her diary, discovered 70 years later in a Portland estate sale, provides our primary account of what she found there. Eleanor's first entry, written the night of her arrival, describes a community unlike any she had encountered. The villagers were polite but distant. They spoke in hushed tones. They avoided looking directly at the frozen lake, even as they walked across it daily. The local boarding house where Eleanor stayed was run by a widow named Martha Brennan, who prepared meals in complete silence and locked all the doors at sunset. But what disturbed Eleanor most was the sight that greeted her the morning after her arrival. As dawn broke over the frozen landscape, she looked out her window and saw them. Small wooden structures dotted across the lake's surface. Cabins, no larger than garden sheds, built directly on the ice. Smoke rose from some of their chimneys, and as the sun climbed higher, Eleanor watched as villagers emerged from their homes and walked across the ice, each approaching a different cabin. They entered. They stayed for hours, and when they finally emerged, their faces held expressions Eleanor could not decipher. Not grief exactly, not joy, something between devotion and madness. Eleanor asked Martha Brennan about the cabins. The widow's response was simple and chilling. They are with their beloved ones. The ice preserves them until spring. Eleanor did not understand. Not yet, not until Reverend Ezekiel Frost came to visit her that afternoon. He was 58 years old, tall and gaunt, with eyes the color of winter sky. He wore black clothing that seemed to absorb light. He explained that he had requested a nurse for the community, anticipating the harsh winter ahead. He thanked Eleanor for her service, and then he invited her to witness what he called the sacred tradition of Coldwater Hollow. That evening, as darkness consumed the landscape and temperatures dropped to lethal levels, Reverend Frost led Eleanor across the frozen lake. Their footsteps crunched on snow-covered ice. The only light came from lanterns hanging outside each cabin, and as they approached the nearest structure, Eleanor heard something that made her blood freeze colder than the air around her. Singing. Someone inside was singing. A lullaby, soft and tender. The voice belonged to a woman, and she sang as though comforting a sleeping child. Reverend Frost opened the cabin door. What Eleanor saw inside would haunt her for the rest of her life. But before we continue, I need you to understand something. What happened in Coldwater Hollow was not an isolated incident of madness. It was a community tradition, practiced for generations, accepted as normal by everyone who lived there. The question we must ask ourselves is not how one person could commit such acts, but how an entire community could participate year after year, believing they were doing something sacred. What Eleanor discovered in that cabin was only the beginning. To understand what happened in Coldwater Hollow, we must first understand the world that created it. Maine in the early 20th century was a place of harsh contrasts. Coastal cities like Portland thrived with shipbuilding and trade. But venture inland, past the railway lines, past the logging camps, into the deep forests and isolated valleys, and you found communities that existed almost outside of time. Coldwater Hollow was established in 1847 by a religious group that had splintered from the Congregationalist Church. They were followers of a preacher named Josiah Ashford, who believed that death was not an ending, but a transformation that required careful spiritual guidance. Ashford taught that the soul remained connected to the physical body for a period after death, and that the community had a sacred obligation to preserve and honor the deceased during this transitional state. Initially, this meant elaborate funeral rites and extended mourning periods, nothing particularly unusual for the Victorian era, when death rituals were already quite elaborate. Families would photograph their dead, hold multi-day wakes, and create memorial jewelry from the hair of the deceased. Josiah Ashford's teachings fit within this broader cultural framework, but isolation changes communities. It amplifies beliefs. It removes the moderating influence of outside observation. By the 1870s, Coldwater Hollow had developed its own unique interpretation of Ashford's teachings. The community had discovered that their lake froze completely during winter, and that the extreme cold naturally preserved organic matter. Someone suggested that instead of burying their dead immediately, they could preserve them in the ice until spring, allowing extended time for the soul's transition. The first ice cabins were built in 1873, 3 simple structures where deceased community members were placed during the winter months. Families would visit daily, maintaining a vigil until the spring thaw, when traditional burial would finally occur. Over the decades, the practice evolved. The cabins became more elaborate, the visitations more ritualized, the theology more complex. By the time Eleanor Hartley arrived in 1923, the tradition had been practiced for 50 years. 2 entire generations had grown up believing it was normal, expected, sacred. The community of 1923 consisted of 47 people. They were primarily farmers, with a few craftsmen, a general store owner, and Reverend Ezekiel Frost, who had inherited both his position and his fervent belief in the tradition from his father, who had inherited it from his father before him. The Frost family had led Coldwater Hollow since its founding. Eleanor's diary describes the community's daily rhythm. Mornings began with household chores and farm work, though winter limited agricultural activity. Midday brought the visitations. Every family with a deceased member in the ice cabins would cross the lake, often bringing food, blankets, and personal items. They would spend hours inside the cabins. Evenings were communal, with shared meals at the general store and prayer services led by Reverend Frost. The winter of 1922 to 1923 was particularly severe. The lake froze in early November, earlier than usual. By January, when Eleanor arrived, there were 12 cabins dotting the frozen surface, 12 deceased community members being preserved. The youngest had died just 3 weeks before Eleanor's arrival, an infant named Samuel, only 6 months old, who had succumbed to pneumonia. The oldest had been dead for nearly 4 months. A woman named Adelaide Marsh, 72 years old, who had died in September, and whose family was maintaining their vigil through the long winter. Eleanor's medical training immediately raised concerns. She understood decomposition, bacterial growth, and the health risks of extended contact with deceased bodies. But the extreme cold did indeed slow these processes dramatically. The bodies, frozen solid, remained relatively preserved. This scientific reality had allowed the tradition to continue, providing just enough evidence to support the community's beliefs. But Eleanor noticed something else. Something the community either could not see or refused to acknowledge. The expressions on the faces of those who visited the cabins, the way they touched the frozen bodies, the intimate nature of their time inside those small, heated spaces, the reluctance to leave, the way some families visited multiple times per day, staying long after sunset, emerging only when other community members came searching for them. This was not grief. This was not spiritual devotion. This was obsession. Eleanor attempted to raise her concerns with Reverend Frost. His response was swift and dismissive. She was an outsider. She could not possibly understand the sacred nature of their tradition. The community had practiced this for 50 years, without incident. Her modern medical views had no place in spiritual matters, but Eleanor could not let it go. Her diary entries from late January show growing alarm. She noticed that some families brought fresh clothing to dress their deceased. She saw one man, Benjamin Cole, enter his wife's cabin with flowers, as though visiting a living person. She observed Martha Brennan spending 6 hours daily in the cabin containing her husband's body, emerging only for meals. And then Eleanor made a discovery that changed everything. In the community's small church, she found historical records, birth certificates, death certificates, marriage licenses, burial records dating back to the community's founding. She spent 3 nights reading by candlelight, cross-referencing dates and names. What she found suggested something impossible, something that contradicted everything Reverend Frost had told her. According to the records, the ice cabin tradition had indeed begun in 1873, but it had been abandoned in 1891 after a scandal that resulted in 3 community members leaving Coldwater Hollow in disgrace. The tradition had remained dormant for 20 years, until Ezekiel Frost became Reverend in 1911. He had revived it, reinforced it, expanded it beyond anything his predecessors had practiced. Eleanor confronted the Reverend with the records. She demanded to know what had happened in 1891, why the tradition had been stopped, what scandal had been severe enough to halt a practice the community considered sacred. Reverend Frost's response was calm but absolute. Those records were incomplete. She had misunderstood. The tradition had never stopped, and if she valued her safety, she would not speak of this again. That night, Eleanor decided to do something reckless, something that would reveal the true nature of Coldwater Hollow's ice cabins. She would visit them alone after midnight when the community slept. She would see for herself what really happened inside those small wooden structures on the frozen lake. She never expected to find what she did. Eleanor's diary entry from February 3, 1923, is written in handwriting so shaky it becomes nearly illegible in places. It begins with a simple statement: "I know the truth now. God help me, I know what they are doing." On the night of February 2nd, Eleanor waited until after midnight. The temperature had dropped to 28 degrees below zero, the kind of cold that burns exposed skin within minutes. She dressed in layers of wool, wrapped her face in a scarf, and took a lantern from the boarding house kitchen. Martha Brennan slept soundly, as did the entire village. The snow muffled all sound. The frozen lake stretched before Eleanor like a vast white desert. She approached the nearest cabin. It belonged to the Brennan family, containing Martha's husband, Joseph, who had died in October from a heart ailment. Eleanor had met Martha, found her kind despite her silence, and could not reconcile that kindness with the suspicions growing in her mind. The cabin door was unlocked. It creaked open. Inside, Eleanor raised her lantern. The space was no larger than 10 feet by 10 feet. A small iron stove provided heat, though it had burned down to embers, and there on a wooden platform lay Joseph Brennan's body. He was dressed in his Sunday suit. His hands were folded across his chest. His skin had the waxy, pale quality of frozen flesh, but his eyes were closed peacefully, his expression serene. Nothing appeared immediately disturbing, but then Eleanor noticed the details. Fresh flowers in a vase beside the body, replaced recently despite the winter. A chair positioned intimately close to the platform. A blanket draped partially over the body, as though someone had tucked him in. Personal items scattered around, a pipe, a book, a photograph of Martha and Joseph on their wedding day. Eleanor examined the body more closely. This was where her medical training became crucial. She noted scratches on the platform beneath the body. She found strands of dark hair not belonging to Joseph, whose hair was white. She discovered that the body had been repositioned recently, the limbs arranged differently than they would naturally fall. But what horrified Eleanor most was the discovery of lipstick traces on Joseph's frozen cheek, on his lips, fresh enough that they had not faded. Someone was kissing the corpse. Recently, repeatedly. Eleanor fled the cabin, but she could not flee what she now understood. She visited 3 more cabins that night. Each revealed similar evidence. Adelaide Marsh's cabin contained love letters written by her widowed husband, addressed to her as though she could read them. The letters spoke of missing her warmth, counting days until spring, cherishing their time together in the cabin. Benjamin Cole's cabin, containing his deceased wife, Margaret, showed the most disturbing evidence. The body was dressed in a nightgown, positioned as though sleeping. The heating stove burned hotter than in other cabins, and Eleanor found something that made her stomach turn. A journal, left open on a small table, containing Benjamin's daily entries about his visits. The entries described touching his wife's hands, lying beside her, speaking to her for hours, believing he could feel her spiritual presence responding to him. The final cabin Eleanor visited that night belonged to the Hartwell family. Their teenage daughter, Grace, had died in December from influenza. She was 16 years old. Her mother, Catherine Hartwell, had not left the cabin in 3 days, according to village gossip. Eleanor found Catherine there, asleep in the chair beside her, daughter's body wrapped in blankets, her hand resting on Grace's frozen arm. Eleanor woke Catherine gently. The woman's reaction was not anger at the intrusion, but relief at having company. Catherine spoke softly, explaining that she could not bear to leave Grace alone in the cold, that she felt her daughter's spirit most strongly in this cabin, that she had conversations with Grace, receiving guidance and comfort. That spring was an enemy now, because it would force her to bury her child, forever. Eleanor tried to explain the medical reality, that Grace was dead, that the body was a shell, nothing more, that Catherine's grief, while understandable, had crossed into dangerous territory. Catherine's response was simple and devastating. "You do not understand what it is to lose a child. Until you do, you have no right to judge how I grieve." Eleanor returned to the boarding house as dawn approached. She did not sleep. She spent the day documenting everything in her diary, trying to process what she had witnessed. The community was not simply preserving their dead, they were maintaining relationships with corpses, treating frozen bodies as though they were still alive, engaging in acts that, while not explicitly violent, crossed every boundary of decency and sanity that Eleanor understood. But Eleanor faced a terrible dilemma. She was completely isolated. The nearest town with law enforcement was 23 miles away, accessible only by dangerous winter travel. Dennis Community outnumbered her 47-1. And more importantly, what law was being broken? The bodies belonged to community members. They were family members. No one was being harmed, at least not in any way that the legal system of 1923 would recognize. Eleanor decided to document everything. She began taking detailed medical notes. She sketched diagrams of the cabins. She recorded conversations with community members, asking careful questions about the tradition's history and practice. She hoped to compile enough evidence to present to authorities once spring arrived and travel became possible. But Reverend Frost was watching. On February 7th, he visited Eleanor again. He explained that some community members had reported seeing lantern light moving across the lake at night. He wanted to know if Eleanor had been taking unauthorized walks. He reminded her that the ice could be dangerous, that there were thin spots, that someone unfamiliar with the lakes, geography could easily fall through and drown. The threat was implicit but clear. Eleanor stopped her midnight investigations, but she continued her documentation, now more carefully. She interviewed elderly community members, learning fragments of history they were willing to share. She discovered that the tradition had indeed been controversial in the past, that in 1891, a visiting priest from Portland had witnessed the practices and attempted to intervene, that 3 families had left the community after his visit, refusing to participate any longer. She also learned about previous nurses. Eleanor was not the first medical professional to come to Coldwater Hollow. There had been another 20 years earlier. A nurse named Alice Brennan, related to Martha's family. Alice had stayed through one winter, then departed abruptly in spring. No one would speak about why she left or where she went. Eleanor became determined to find Alice Brennan. If she was still alive, she might provide answers. She might be an ally who understood what Eleanor was witnessing. But before Eleanor could pursue this lead, something happened that changed the nature of her investigation entirely. On February 14th, Valentine's Day, the community gathered for a special ceremony that Reverend Frost called the Blessing of Continued Bonds. What Eleanor witnessed during that ceremony was so disturbing that she could barely write about it coherently. Her diary entries from that period are fragmented, traumatized, filled with crossed-out passages and ink blots where tears fell on the page. Tell me in the comments what you think is happening so far. Do you believe this was a community in the grip of shared delusion? Or was something more deliberate and sinister occurring? Your theories always provide fascinating perspectives that I might not have considered. The Blessing of Continued Bonds was the community's most sacred ceremony. It occurred once each winter, typically in mid-February, halfway through the preservation period. According to Reverend Frost, this was when the barrier between the living and the dead was thinnest, when the souls of the deceased could most clearly communicate with their loved ones. The entire community gathered at sunset on the frozen lake, forming a circle around the 12 ice cabins. Each family stood before their respective cabin. Reverend Frost led prayers, invoking Josiah Ashford's original teachings about the soul's journey and the sacred duty of the living to guide the dead through transformation. But then the ceremony took an unexpected turn. Reverend Frost instructed each family to enter their cabin, spend 1 hour in private communion with their deceased, and emerge with a token of blessing. The token could be anything meaningful: a lock of hair, a piece of clothing, a personal item. This token would be carried until spring burial, serving as a connection between worlds. Eleanor watched as families disappeared into the cabins. The ceremony should have been solemn, respectful, brief, but an hour passed, then 2. The families did not emerge. More alarming, Eleanor began to notice sounds. From multiple cabins came voices, conversations. Some families appeared to be talking to themselves, but they spoke as though receiving responses. One voice rose in laughter, another in sobbing. a third in what sounded disturbingly like intimate whispers. Eleanor approached Benjamin Cole's cabin. She could hear his voice. "And clearly, I have missed you so much, Margaret. Your hands are cold, but I can warm them. Let me warm them. The Reverend says you can feel me. Can you feel me, my love? I have brought your favorite perfume. Let me apply it to your skin. There, just as you liked it. Are you pleased?" Eleanor felt physically ill. She moved to another cabin. Catherine Hartwell's voice drifted through the wooden walls. "Grace, my darling girl, I have brought your hairbrush. Your hair has tangled during your rest. Let me brush it for you. 100 strokes, just like we did every night. You always loved this, remember? Remember how you would sit at your vanity and I would brush your beautiful hair. We can still have that. We can still have our moments together." At the Marsh cabin, Adelaide's widowed husband George was singing a love song from their youth. His voice cracked with emotion, but remained surprisingly steady. Eleanor heard movement inside, as though George was dancing alone, or dancing with a frozen corpse. 3 hours into the ceremony, Reverend Frost began moving between cabins, knocking on doors, calling families to emerge. They did so reluctantly, faces flushed despite the cold, expressions combining ecstasy and grief. Each carried their token of blessing. Benjamin Cole held a locket containing Margaret's hair. Catherine Hartwell clutched Grace's favorite ribbon. George Marsh had Adelaide's wedding ring on a chain around his neck. The community formed their circle again. Reverend Frost led a final prayer, thanking the deceased for their continued presence, promising to maintain vigilance until spring allowed their final transformation through burial. The ceremony concluded. The families returned to their homes. Eleanor remained on the ice, watching the cabins in the moonlight. She understood now. This was not preservation. This was not spiritual guidance. This was a community that had collectively decided that death was optional, that with sufficient cold and sufficient willingness to ignore reality, relationships could continue indefinitely. But the true horror was still to come. 3 days after the Valentine's ceremony, Eleanor made a discovery that connected everything. She was searching the boarding house attic for additional blankets when she found a trunk hidden behind old furniture. The trunk was locked, but the mechanism was old and easily forced. Inside, Eleanor found personal belongings, clothing from 20 years earlier, medical supplies, from an outdated nursing kit, and most importantly, 3 journals. The journals belonged to Alice Brennan, the nurse who had come to Coldwater Hollow in 1903, exactly 20 years before Eleanor's arrival. Alice had documented her experiences in detail, and reading her entries was like reading Eleanor's own diary, written by someone else. The same initial confusion, the same growing horror, the same realization of what the ice cabins truly represented. But Alice had discovered something Eleanor had not yet found. According to her journal entries from March 1903, Alice had been researching the 1891 scandal that ended the tradition's first iteration. She had interviewed the elderly Martha Brennan, who was young Martha Ashford then, and learned the truth. In 1891, a young woman named Constance Frost, the Reverend's mother, had died during childbirth. The baby survived. Her husband, Samuel Frost, placed her in an ice cabin and maintained his vigil through winter. But when spring arrived and the ice began to thaw, Samuel refused to allow burial. He reinforced the cabin. He transported blocks of ice from the mountains to keep her frozen. He maintained his visits throughout summer, despite the body's deterioration, despite the community's horror, despite the obvious insanity of his actions. It took 3 community members physically restraining Samuel to finally bury Constance in June 1891. Samuel left Coldwater Hollow in disgrace, taking his infant son Ezekiel with him. The community abolished the ice cabin tradition, recognizing that it had enabled Samuel's madness. But Samuel and Ezekiel returned in 1911. Ezekiel, now a grown man trained in his father's religious beliefs, became reverend after the previous minister's death. He had reinstated the tradition, claiming it was God's will, that his father had been persecuted for honoring sacred teachings that the community had lost its spiritual way by abandoning the practice. Alice's journals revealed more disturbing details. She had documented instances of families spending entire nights in the cabins. She had found evidence of bodies being moved, repositioned, redressed multiple times. She had discovered that one widower, Nathan Marsh, had been maintaining a cabin for his wife for 3 consecutive winters, refusing burial, finding excuses each spring to postpone, until the community finally intervened. Alice had confronted Reverend Frost with her findings. His response was to call a community meeting where he publicly questioned Alice's mental stability, suggested that her unmarried status made her unable to understand the bonds between spouses, and ultimately convinced the community that Alice's presence was disruptive to their spiritual practices. Alice left Coldwater Hollow in April 1903. Her final journal entry, dated April 19th, was brief. "They have won. I cannot fight an entire community that chooses madness over truth, but I leave this record hidden, hoping someday another will find it and understand. What happens in those cabins is not love. It is not grief. It is something far darker that has been sanctified through religious justification. I pray that someone braver than I am will eventually stop them." Eleanor understood that she was that someone. Alice had left the journals as evidence, as a warning, as a call to action. But Eleanor also understood the danger. If Alice, after months of careful documentation, had been driven away by community pressure, what chance did Eleanor have, especially now, in the depths of winter, with no escape route and no allies? Eleanor spent the next week verifying Alice's information. She interviewed Martha Brennan privately, who reluctantly confirmed the story about Constance Frost and Samuel's madness. Martha admitted that she had always feared the tradition's return, but that Reverend Ezekiel Frost had such complete authority over the community that no one dared challenge him. Eleanor also made a more disturbing discovery. According to Martha, there were currently 2 community members whose deceased relatives had been in ice cabins for multiple winters. Benjamin Cole was in his 3rd winter with Margaret's body, and there was another, a reclusive farmer named Silas Harding, who maintained a cabin on the far side of the lake. His wife Emma had died 5 years ago, but according to Martha's whispered confession, Silas had kept Emma's body preserved through 5 consecutive winters, building increasingly elaborate systems of ice storage, refusing to allow burial, claiming that Emma's soul had not yet completed its transformation. Eleanor knew she had to see Silas Harding's cabin. She had to understand how far this obsession could extend. On February 24th, Eleanor waited for a snowstorm. Heavy weather would provide cover for her investigation. At 3 in the morning, with snow falling so thick it created walls of white, Eleanor crossed the lake to the far shore, where Silas Harding's cabin stood isolated from the others. The structure was larger than the family cabins near the village. Silas had expanded it over the years, adding walls, reinforcing the foundation with additional ice blocks, creating something more permanent than the temporary shelters others used. Smoke rose from a chimney. Light glowed through gaps in the wooden walls. Eleanor approached cautiously. She heard Silas's voice inside, talking continuously as though in conversation, but no other voice answered. The words were disturbing in their intimacy, their assumption of response, their complete detachment from reality. "Emma, my darling, I have brought your breakfast," Yes, I know you cannot eat, but I remember how you loved my cooking. I have made your favorite, pancakes with maple syrup. I will place them beside you. There, can you smell them? I believe you can. I believe your spirit appreciates these gestures. The Reverend assures me that you are aware, that you feel my devotion, that our time together is not wasted, but sacred. Eleanor peered through a gap in the wall. What she saw made her step back in horror. The cabin's interior was arranged like a bedroom, a proper bed with mattress and pillows. Emma Harding's body lay on this bed, dressed in a nightgown, covered with quilts. But the body showed signs of advanced deterioration despite the cold. 5 years of freezing and minimal thawing had taken their toll. The skin was discolored, the features distorted. This was no longer preservation, but something grotesque. Silas sat beside the bed, holding Emma's frozen hand, speaking to her as though she was merely sleeping. He brushed hair from her forehead, he adjusted her blankets, and then, as Eleanor watched in frozen horror, Silas leaned down and kissed his wife's decomposed lips. Eleanor ran. She did not care about the noise, about being discovered. She fled, across the lake, through the storm, back to the boarding house. She vomited in the snow behind the building. She shook with cold and horror and the absolute certainty that she was trapped in a community that had long ago crossed from grief into collective insanity. But when Eleanor entered the boarding house, she found Reverend Frost waiting for her. He sat calmly in the common room, his expression unreadable. "You visited Silas," he said. "Not a question, a statement." Eleanor tried to deny it, but Frost raised his hand to silence her. "Silas informed me of your intrusion. He saw your lantern approaching. He watched you flee. And now we must discuss your future in Coldwater Hollow, Miss Hartley." What followed was a conversation that Eleanor documented in detail. Reverend Frost did not threaten her explicitly. Instead, he spoke of community solidarity, of the importance of unity, of the danger of outside judgment, disrupting sacred practices. He explained that Eleanor had two choices. She could accept the community's traditions, cease her investigations, and continue her nursing duties without interference until spring allowed her departure. Or she could continue to create disruption, in which case the community would take measures to protect itself and its practices. He did not specify what those measures might be, but his meaning was clear. Eleanor realized she was being warned: submit or face consequences. In a community this isolated, consequences could mean anything. Accident on the ice, unexplained illness, disappearance explained as a woman foolishly wandering into a snowstorm. Eleanor agreed to Reverend Frost's terms. She had no choice. Survival required compliance, at least outwardly. But she continued her documentation in secret, hiding her journals more carefully, preparing evidence for the day she could finally escape. She also began to understand the psychological mechanism that allowed this horror to persist. The community was not filled with monsters. They were ordinary people who had been born into a tradition, who had been taught from childhood that this was normal, who genuinely believed they were honoring their dead. The madness was normalized. The aberrant had become sacred, and anyone who questioned it was the enemy, threatening their ability to maintain relationships with deceased loved ones. This, Eleanor wrote, is how horror persists. Not through obvious evil, but through incremental acceptance, through tradition that goes unquestioned, through isolation that prevents outside perspective, through religious justification that sanctifies the unconscionable. The winter continued. Eleanor survived by silence, and she waited for spring. Eleanor Hartley left Coldwater Hollow on April 7, 1923, the day the ice began its final thaw. She departed without ceremony, catching a ride with a mail courier who made the first spring delivery to the isolated community. She carried her belongings, her nursing equipment, and 3 journals documenting everything she had witnessed. She never returned. What happened to Eleanor after her departure remains unclear. Her journals eventually reached Portland, but there is no record of her filing official complaints or contacting law enforcement. Some historians suggest she was too traumatized to pursue the matter. Others believe she was threatened into silence. A third theory, based on fragmentary evidence, suggests she did try to report what she witnessed, but was dismissed as a hysterical woman making outlandish claims about a respectable rural community. Coldwater Hollow continued its tradition. The ice cabins appeared every winter. The visitations continued. The community remained isolated from outside interference, but fragments from later decades reveal that the story did not end with Eleanor's departure. Multiple discoveries separated by years gradually exposed the full horror of what had been happening on Lake Ashford. In 1953, 30 years after Eleanor's winter in Coldwater Hollow, a geography professor from the University of Maine named Dr. Robert Chen was mapping remote lakes in the state. He reached Lake Ashford in August, expecting to find a small settlement. Instead, he found abandonment. The village of Coldwater Hollow stood empty. Houses remained furnished, suggesting rapid departure rather than gradual decline. The church contained records dating back to the community's founding, but the entries ended abruptly in March 1947. Dr. Chen documented the site but found no human remains, no signs of violence, no explanation for the community's disappearance. His report noted one oddity. Scattered across the lake shore were the remains of wooden structures, dozens of them in various states of decay. Small cabins that had once stood on the ice now collapsed and rotting on the shore where spring thaws had left them over decades. Dr. Chen's report sat in university archives for 20 years before anyone connected it to Eleanor Hartley's journals. That connection was made by a graduate student named Patricia Whitmore in 1973, exactly 50 years after Eleanor's winter in Coldwater Hollow. Patricia was researching rural nursing practices for her thesis when she discovered Eleanor's journals in a Portland estate sale. The journals had belonged to Eleanor's niece, who died without heirs, and her possessions were being liquidated. Patricia recognized the historical significance immediately. She contacted Dr. Chen, now retired, and together they organized an expedition to Coldwater Hollow in summer 1974. What they found provided answers, but also deeper questions. The abandoned village had deteriorated significantly since Dr. Chen's first visit. Roofs had collapsed, forests were reclaiming the structures. But the church still stood, and inside, Patricia found additional documents that Eleanor had never seen. Parish records, baptismal certificates, death certificates, and buried in a locked cabinet behind the altar, personal journals belonging to Reverend Ezekiel Frost. Frost's journals covered 36 years, from 1911 when he became reverend until 1947 when the entries stopped. They were written in small, precise handwriting, and they revealed the full extent of his vision for Coldwater Hollow. Ezekiel Frost had not simply revived his father's tradition. He had expanded it into something far more elaborate. His journals described his theology in detail, the belief that through proper preservation and devoted attention, the souls of the dead could be kept in a state between life and death indefinitely. That this intermediate state was superior to both earthly life and heavenly afterlife, because it allowed continued communion between the living and the dead without the complications of biological needs or physical decline. Frost wrote extensively about teaching community members to embrace this intermediate state, to see the frozen bodies not as corpses, but as vessels for souls in transformation. to understand their time in the ice cabins as sacred intimacy, to resist the corruption of outside thinking that would label their devotion as madness. But the journals also revealed growing problems. By the late 1930s, some community members were struggling. Younger people, born after the tradition's reinstatement, were questioning its premises. Several attempted to leave the community, but were prevented by their elders. In 1941, a teenage girl named Rebecca Harding tried to convince her father Silas to finally bury her mother Emma, who had been frozen for 19 years. Silas refused. Rebecca ran away, making it to the nearest town before being returned by authorities who saw the matter as a family dispute. Frost's journal entry from that incident is chilling in its pragmatism. He wrote that Rebecca's rebellion demonstrated the danger of insufficient spiritual education, that children raised in Coldwater Hollow must be more completely immersed in the tradition from birth, with no exposure to corrupting outside influences. He implemented new rules: no contact with outsiders beyond essential commerce, no secular education, no departure from the community before age 25. The journals end in March 1947 with a final entry that Patricia described as apocalyptic in tone. Frost wrote that he had received a revelation, that the spring thaw was no longer necessary, that with sufficient faith and proper techniques the tradition could be maintained year-round, that the souls in transition could achieve a permanent intermediate state, never requiring burial, never leaving their loved ones. The entry concluded, "Tomorrow we begin the great transformation. We will not bury our beloved ones this spring. We will keep them with us forever. This is God's true will for Coldwater Hollow." There were no entries after that date, no record of what happened when the ice began to thaw in April 1947, as it inevitably did. No documentation of the community's reaction when their frozen loved ones began to decompose in the warming weather. No account of the moment when reality could no longer be denied. Patricia and Dr. Chen searched the area extensively. They found the community cemetery, which contained graves dating back to the 1850s, but nothing after 1911. They searched the lakeshore, the forests, the abandoned houses. They found no mass grave, no evidence of violence, no explanation for where 47 people had gone. But they did find one more piece of evidence. In the basement of Reverend Frost's house, they discovered a trapdoor leading to a root cellar. The cellar had been expanded into a large underground chamber. The walls were lined with shelves, and on those shelves were jars, hundreds of glass jars, carefully labeled with names and dates. The jars contained preserved organic tissue, samples taken from deceased community members, hair, skin, bone fragments, and other materials that Patricia could not bring herself to identify in her later reports. Each jar was labeled with a name from the community and a date, most ranging from 1911 to 1947. Reverend Frost, it seemed, had been collecting pieces of the dead for 36 years. Whether as religious relics, scientific specimens, or evidence of some deeper obsession, Patricia could not determine. But the collection suggested that the ice cabin tradition was merely the visible surface of Frost's fixation with preserving the dead. The mystery of the community's disappearance remained unsolved until 1982, when a final piece of evidence emerged. A woman named Sarah Harding contacted Patricia Whitmore after reading a published article about Coldwater Hollow. Sarah identified herself as Rebecca Harding's daughter. Her mother, the girl who had tried to convince her father Silas to bury Emma, had eventually escaped Coldwater Hollow and built a life elsewhere. Rebecca had rarely spoken about her childhood, but before her death in 1980, she had given Sarah a letter to be opened only after she passed. The letter contained Rebecca's account of Coldwater Hollow's final days. In April 1947, when Reverend Frost announced that the bodies would not be buried despite the thawing ice, the Community fractured. Some families, desperate to maintain their connection to the dead, supported Frost's plan. Others, finally recognizing the madness they had been participating in, demanded immediate burial. The conflict escalated. According to Rebecca, violence erupted. Families fought over the rapidly decomposing bodies. The ice cabins, weakened by thaw, collapsed into the water. Bodies that had been preserved for months or years were suddenly exposed to spring temperatures. The smell became unbearable. Disease spread, and in the chaos, Reverend Frost disappeared. Rebecca's family, along with several others who rejected Frost's final vision, fled Coldwater Hollow in late April 1947. They scattered to different towns and cities, taking new names, refusing to speak of their origins. Rebecca believed the remaining community members, those who had supported Frost, either died from disease and starvation after the breakdown of social order, or fled separately and also disappeared into anonymity. Rebecca's letter concluded with a statement that Patricia found haunting. She wrote that she had spent her life trying to forget Coldwater Hollow, but that she could never fully escape one memory. The day she last saw her father, Silas, he was holding what remained of her mother Emma's body, which had been frozen for 23 years. He was trying to carry it away from the collapsing ice cabin, trying to preserve it somehow, refusing to accept that Emma was truly, finally, irrevocably gone. Rebecca never learned what happened to Silas. He vanished with the others, taking Emma's remains with him. Lake Ashford still exists. The ruins of Coldwater Hollow can still be found by those willing to hike through dense forest and navigate overgrown trails. The church stands, though its roof has collapsed. The cemetery remains, with graves from the 1850s to 1911 and nothing after. And if you visit in winter, when the lake freezes solid, you can still see the remains of wooden structures scattered along the shore, remnants of the ice cabins that once held the dead. But the people of Coldwater Hollow are gone. 47 souls who participated in a tradition that began as grief and evolved into obsession. A community that chose to preserve death rather than accept it, and ultimately paid a price we can only guess at. The question that haunts researchers is not what happened, but why. Why did an entire community participate in something so clearly disturbing? Why did no one intervene? Why did the tradition persist for decades despite multiple opportunities for someone to stop it? Several theories have emerged over the years. The first and most charitable suggests that Coldwater Hollow was a community trapped by isolation and religious indoctrination. That Reverend Ezekiel Frost exploited their grief and their faith, gradually normalizing practices that any outside observer would recognize as madness. That the community members were victims as much as participants, raised in a system that taught them to see horror as sacred. The second theory is darker. It suggests that the community knew exactly what they were doing, that the ice cabin tradition provided socially sanctioned permission to engage in behaviors they knew were taboo, that the religious framework was merely justification for desires that existed independent of faith, that they were not deluded, but deliberate. The third theory, proposed by a psychologist who studied Patricia Whitmore's research, suggests something more complex, that the tradition created a psychological dependency where the act of preserving and visiting the dead became addictive, that families could not let go because the ritual itself provided comfort that nothing else could match, that they were trapped not by delusion or desire, but by emotional need that overrode rational thought. We will never know which theory, if any, is correct. The people who could provide answers are gone, scattered to anonymity, or dead themselves. Eleanor Hartley never published her journals. Alice Brennan's fate remains unknown. Rebecca Harding took most of her story to the grave. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Coldwater Hollow is not what happened there, but what it suggests about human nature. We like to believe that horror is obvious, that we would recognize madness when we see it, that we would never participate in something so clearly wrong. Coldwater Hollow challenges those assumptions. It shows us how tradition can sanctify the unconscionable, how isolation can normalize the aberrant, how grief can transform into something unrecognizable, yet still feel like love. To this day, no one knows the full truth of what happened in those ice cabins. We have Eleanor's observations, Alice's warnings, Frost's journals, Rebecca's memories. But we do not have the perspective of the families who visited their dead daily, who touched frozen flesh and believed they were touching souls. We do not know what they told themselves, what they truly felt, whether they recognized their actions as transgressive or genuinely believed they were sacred. Lake Ashford keeps its secrets. The ice still forms each winter, thick enough to walk upon, thick enough to build upon. And sometimes locals report seeing lights moving across the frozen surface after dark, unexplained, unaccounted for, probably just reflection from houses on the distant shore. Probably nothing at all. But once you know what happened there, once you understand what those wooden structures represented, once you imagine the scenes that played out in those small heated spaces on the frozen lake, you cannot help but wonder, cannot help but see those lights and ask yourself, what if the tradition never truly ended? What if some members of Coldwater Hollow did not flee but remained hidden in the forest, maintaining their practices in secret? What if the great transformation that Reverend Frost promised actually occurred? In some form we cannot comprehend. These are questions without answers. Ghost stories, perhaps, or perhaps something more disturbing. The recognition that humanity's capacity for normalizing horror is limitless when given the right circumstances. Eleanor Hartley died in 1978, never having spoken publicly about her winter in Coldwater Hollow. Her journals were her only testimony. Before her death, she wrote a final entry, dated 55 years after she left Lake Ashford. It read simply, "I still dream of the ice cabins. I still hear the voices of people talking to the dead as though they could answer. I still remember the cold, and I still wonder if I should have done more, if I could have stopped them, if my silence makes me complicit in what they became." That question remains relevant. When we witness horror, when we recognize madness, what is our obligation? Eleanor chose survival over intervention. Was she wrong? Could she have changed anything? Or would she have simply become another victim, another disappearance, another mystery? These are the questions I leave you with today. What would you have done in Eleanor's place? How far does our obligation extend when we witness something we know is wrong? Tell me in the comments. Your thoughts on these moral questions always provide perspectives I find valuable and thought-provoking. If this story disturbed you, if it made you think, if it reminded you that horror is not always supernatural, but sometimes profoundly human, then subscribe to our channel. Join our haunted community of listeners who appreciate stories that explore the darkest aspects of history and human nature. Click the bell icon to be notified when the next episode arrives. Until then, remember that the most terrifying monsters are not the ones we imagine, but the ones we become when we convince ourselves that the unthinkable is acceptable. Thank you for listening. Stay safe. And, perhaps, on cold winter nights, stay away from frozen lakes.